So we're starting chapter 25 in your world history book on World War II. We're going to be doing this in like 6 different sections there. First talking about the coming war, onto the European theater, which is 1939 to 1941. Then the United States turning from neutrality to war. Then onto the European theater in 1941 to 1945, the later part. And then on to the Pacific Theater, 1941 to 1945, and on to the aftermath. And you can see some of these pictures here that all have to do with World War II. So let's begin. The coming war. The coming war. We had the World War I and the peace that failed. The Germany was defeated and had to pay all these reparations. And the German economy was totally in ruins. And because of the depression that was in America and affected the whole world, the German inflation was outrageous, and Germany was looking for help at that time, and there was civil unrest during that time. So because of all this, the ambitious dictators in Germany, not alone in Germany, but also in Italy and Japan and Russia, were strengthening their armies up. And the League of Nations that was set up by Woodrow Wilson totally had failed, and it was unable to resolve any international problems at all. And so now we are ripe for a coming war, another world war. You can see some of these pictures in Germany, how Germany was in ruins, and the people were looking for someone or some ruler that could come and help them. And they indeed would get someone like that, but very evil ruler. Rising tensions. Germany grows increasingly bitter and is very humiliated with the Versailles Treaty that was given them. The reparations they had to pay were over 55 million, million. I was gonna say is it billion or million, but anyway, it's a huge amount of money. And they were burdened by these reparations and longing for revenge in some way. And Italy and Japan were very displeased too. They had huge war debts, and they were deprived of their foreign markets. Then they wanted lands for natural resources. They didn't have natural resources, especially Japan. Japan had very little natural resources. So basically, everyone is needy at that time, because of the worldwide depression economically, and people in these countries looking for a leader. And here we have a picture of the Versailles Treaty, and we have Hitler climbing out of the Versailles Treaty there. And I like this picture too. We have the international snake coming, and this is the League of Nations. That's the rabbit there trying to handle the snake. Not a good idea. And here is another one that says a failed peace here. And so this failed peace here is pretty traumatic for the German people. So let's go on. Spiritual problems happened. The world, especially in Europe, was very spiritually blind at this time. And so they were very easy prey. And as we looked at the world then, there was religious liberalism that came out of Darwinism, and socialism, and materialism, and modernism, all these isms. The world was filled in Europe with atheists and agnostics. You can see these ideologies focused toward a new world leader that wasn't Christian at all, that was basically focused on humanism. We went over all these things before. We have a picture here of existentialists, and we have Nietzsche, I should say his name, the father of atheistic existentialism, saying that God is dead. And so that's what's going on in Europe, and very ripe for a world leader to come in, a world tyrant to come in. Ideologies and dictatorships. First of all, there's fascism, and that started in Italy, actually. And even though Italy was on the winning side of World War I, it had huge war debts that they couldn't pay, and so many casualties. And Italy was filled with spiritual emptiness. Inflation, economically, labor strikes. There were all kinds of labor strikes and unemployment and depression going on, and the people were looking again for help in the wrong places. And they were very ripe for a form of socialism, which leads to dictatorship. And they would call, this was called fascism. Here's some pictures. This is pictures of Mussolini, and we'll see him coming in and taking over Italy at this time. Benito Mussolini lived in 1883 to 1945. Well, let's talk about what fascism was, because he was a fascist. And this form of socialism was similar to communism, but it allowed some private property and some businesses. Communism does not. And as long as they could regulate these businesses and people's property and take them if they wanted. So it was a little bit more lenient, but indeed it was a dictatorship. We have the fascist party of Mussolini being called Black Shirts. They called themselves the Black Shirts. And they were totalitarian. Totalitarian means total control, right? That's how I write the word, totalitarian. And they controlled political, economic, cultural, religious, and social activity, all under the control of a dictator. They also had the ideas of Darwin, of evolution, so they didn't believe in God. And they were all looking to a new social order, to have someone come in and be run that new world order. And Mussolini indeed thought that he was the guy. Mussolini promised to end inflation and he wanted to build what was called a revived Roman Empire. Now, he might have taken that from the Bible, but it sounds very evil to me. It's satanic. A revived Roman Empire, and him being what? The Antichrist? Sounds familiar. In 1922, he led a revolt to march on Rome. The king of Italy surrendered and invited Mussolini to form a new government there then. And any opposition that came against Mussolini crushed. In fact, they were all killed. Anybody that came against him. So there wasn't no other parties there to come. He was the total dictator. And his big focus now would be on building a military power to control the world. That's Italy. At the same time, we have same thing going on in Germany. They had severe inflation. Their money was not worth any. They printed more money, and money was worth a lot before. We had no foundation. Money was just floating in the streets. Nobody wanted German money. And they had a lack of spiritual discernment totally, as they went into the Enlightenment and all of this, and very much agnostic type attitudes. And they believed in this promised socialism that started with this guy named Adolf Hitler. Here's a picture of the rise of Nazi Germany coming in, even during the Olympics. I think this is the Olympics. And other countries thought, well, maybe Hitler's not that bad. Maybe socialism's not that bad. And we have a bunch of teenage girls here cheering him on, German girls. So you can see at the beginning, they thought that Hitler was indeed a savior for Germany, for the German people. Adolf Hitler, he lived 1889 to 1945. He was a veteran of World War I. He fought in World War I. He formed, when you think of the Nazis, he formed it was a German Workers' Party, actually. And he was it was more of a small extremist group that got together. They were nationalists, they were anti-democratic, and they were anti-capitalism, very socialism. Hitler was the leader of this party. This party was called National Socialist German Workers' Party. And in German, it was called Nazi. They were called Nazis, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. We think it's a labor party, but now we know what it was, basically a socialist party called Nazis. Nazism was a form of socialism, but relies on terrorist aggression and fanatical racism. You can see there, Nazis were very racists. Hitler. In the beginning, Hitler's revolt for his Nazi party failed, and Hitler actually went to jail. In jail, he had plenty of time to write his book he called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And it even is selling today, you can believe that. Mein Kampf, about himself in prison and his dream in his Nazi ideology. It was an autobiography that he put on for himself and exactly what he believed that he would do. And it was actually a blueprint for Hitler's future. It combined Darwinism with socialist ideas. It also had thoughts that Germans evolved into a master race. He believed that the German people were the master race, and they were the ones that he thought were destined to rule the world. He used this with Darwin's survival of the fittest. So he believed that the Germans were to survive and they were the fittest, and he needed to eliminate certain inferior races. He especially hated Jews, and he wanted to exterminate them, but there were many other peoples too that he did not care for, and he would try to exterminate any peoples that had inferior health or any problem peoples. He would basically want to get rid of them so that his master race could take over. Terrible, huh? Hitler was called Der Führer. Der Führer means the leader. You can see a picture of him, Der Führer. Hitler was out of prison in 1 year, and then he had this very domineering, charismatic personality wherever he went. And some people started following him. And he spread Mein Kampf, his book, all around, and many Germans believed then in evolution and liberalism, and the German people started thinking that they were possibly that master race, you know? And so we have at Reichstag, that's the German legislative body there, became kind of sympathetic to Hitler. And Hitler was then appointed chancellor in January of 1933 with a Nazi majority in the Reichstag, in the government in Germany. And this gave Hitler power to make laws by his own decree. It wiped away the old Weimar Republic totally, and he formed the Der Führer, he called himself, he formed what was called the Third Reich. The Third Reich means the Third Empire, the Third Roman Empire, as he again, just like Mussolini, was believing that he was going to be that great power and have the revived Roman Empire and control the world. Kind of another type of Antichrist, huh? The Third Reich Empire would tolerate no opposition at all, he said, and there'd be no political parties allowed. In fact, he would purge, it says a bloody purge of his own party. So if there was anyone in his own party that disagreed, he'd have them killed. He also rebuilt the German economy as a military machine. So the economy was so broken, but he took every bit that he could get his hands on economically to make a huge military. In fact, he put both men and women in the military, and also in the munition plants to make ammunitions. And people had no choice but to do this. And Hitler declared the Third Reich would last for 1,000 years into the millennium, and he would be the leader. Now, I don't know how we could think that the Third Reich would last for 1,000 years, or that he would even live that long. But he had some delusions of grandeur, that's for sure. He said, today, Germany, and tomorrow, the world. So, the annihilation of the Jews and other inferiors. So remember, he believed that he was a superior race, so he had to get rid of them. He really wanted to get rid of the Jews. It's pretty satanic. So these are pictures of the Holocaust that happened during that time. It was pretty disguised there. It was the most nefarious scheme to totally annihilate or get rid of, annihilation of these races, and started with the Jews. He convinced Germans that Jews were involved in an international campaign to destroy Germany. And he started removing Jews from the positions politically and culturally, and those things at first, and then also boycotting of the Jewish businesses. In 1935, the Jews were stripped of their civil rights. In 1939, the Jews were forbidden to emigrate from Germany at all, basically bringing them to concentration camps. He wouldn't let them leave the country. Also, millions of Slavs and Gypsies were killed too, along with the Jews, and put in concentration camps. And he rounded up and sent many others, anyone that were sympathetic to them, he would send to the concentration camps to be either worked to death or murdered. That was the Holocaust. Undesirables. So the Nazis practiced what's called euthanasia. That is, that if they believed someone was sick or undesirable, if you were handicapped, you were put to death. And also believed in abortion. So any inferior races, the babies would have to be aborted. He did not want to have babies that were not of the master race. And Christians who tried to help the Jews were persecuted and were punished and were sent to the concentration camps. And they did have many Christians that stood up against Hitler. And those that disagreed with Hitler were killed. Hitler hated Judaism, as the Jews believed, and also Christianity, especially evangelical Christians. He said, one is either a German or a Christian. You can't be both. He said, religions are all alike. No matter what you call yourself, they have no future, certainly no future for the Germans. Fascism will come to terms with the church. So shall I. Why not? Tearing up Christianity and rooting it out with his branches and annihilating it in Germany was his goal. To get rid of anything, as he would declare himself like a God figure. So that was in Germany. So we went over Mussolini, and now what's going on? A certain campaign is going on in Japan, of all places, and they called it militarism. So this militarism was the solution to Japan's economy. Again, Japan, the whole world was going through this depression, as we were in the United States, this Great Depression. And they needed resources. So they thought they needed to reach out, and not even reach out, to conquer these other lands to get these hidden resources to Japan. And so the military was in control under General Hideki Tojo. I'm not sure how to pronounce that first part, but Tojo, that's what I know him by. In 1885 to 1948 is when he lived. And he was not the emperor. The emperor was Hirohito, Emperor Hirohito. And he was a younger guy. Here's pictures of Hirohito, and here's pictures of Tojo. And Hirohito was the official head, but he had no real authority. Now the military had taken over. And they used Japan's ancient religious customs to promote the war. So they would tell their generals and those soldiers that they were samurai warriors to their advantage. And the military convinced them that they were divine protected by God and that they could not be defeated. And so a lot of them just went into war just thinking they could not. They were actually going into war almost committing suicide, thinking that they had extra powers. Well, the military dream there was called the Greater East Asia Company Prosperity Sphere, is that they wanted to take over mainland Asia and the islands of the Pacific, because Japan needed these raw materials. And any Japanese leader who opposed the military was assassinated right away by the militarists. So again, we have Japan being headed by a totalitarian dictator, really. And then we have another area. We have the communism in Russia going on. And we already kind of went over that, but there was this threatened international peace as Joseph Stalin took over as dictator of Russia. He killed I know it's like now up to almost 100 million people, they say, as he starved many of the Ukrainians, and also just killing anyone that was opposed to him. His aim was to make Russia a modern industry and a military state to dominate the world. The same thing, to dominate the world. But many failed at this time to recognize the danger of communism. He was a communist. And in fact, in the United States in 1933, the United States officially even recognized the communist government of Russia, thinking that communism was not going to be a threat under our President Roosevelt, FDR. We made loans to Russia to help them, even in the midst of their communism, and we also even sent technology to Russia. So not really realizing what was going on was very horrific, what was going on in Russia at the time, and the people being murdered, and whole cultures or whole parts of Russia being starved to death is terrible. So I am going to stop there before we get into the aggressors. We're going to get into the aggressors on the march, and we'll see how each one of these countries started to march out to conquer other lands, and we'll get into that in the next video.